HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Age of Walls: How Barriers Between Nations Are Changing Our World, by Tim Marshall, read by Nigel Patterson. Introduction. The border wall between Israel and the West Bank is among the most forbidding and hostile in the world. Viewed from up close, whichever side you find yourself on, it rears up from the ground, overwhelming and dominating you. Faced by this blank expanse of steel and concrete, you are dwarfed not only by its size, but by what it represents. You are on one side, they are on the other. 30 years ago, a wall came down, ushering in what looked like a new era of openness and internationalism. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan went to the Brandenburg Gate in divided Berlin and called out to his opposite number in the Soviet Union, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 2 years later it fell. Berlin, Germany, and then Europe were united once more. In those heady times, some intellectuals predicted an end of history. However, history does not end. In recent years, the cry, "Tear down this wall," is losing the argument against fortress mentality. It is struggling to be heard, unable to compete with the frightening heights of mass migration, the backlash against globalization, the resurgence of nationalism, the collapse of communism, and the 9/11 attacks and their aftermath. These are the fault lines that will shape our world for years to come. We are seeing walls being built along borders everywhere. Despite globalization and advances in technology, we seem to be feeling more divided than ever. Thousands of miles of walls and fences have gone up around the world in the 21st century. At least 65 countries, more than a third of the world's nation-states, have built barriers along their borders. Half of those erected since World War II sprang up between 2000 and now. Within a few years, the European nations could have more miles of walls, fences, and barriers on their borders than there were at the height of the Cold War. They began by separating Greece and Macedonia, Macedonia and Serbia and Hungary, and as we became less shocked by each stretch of barbed wire, others followed suit. Slovenia began building on the Croatian border, the Austrians fenced off Slovenia, and Sweden put up barriers to prevent illegal immigrants crossing from Denmark, while Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have all started on defensive fortifications on their borders with Russia. Europe is certainly not alone. The UAE has built a fence along its border with Oman, Kuwait likewise with Iraq. Iraq and Iran maintain a physical divide, as do Iran and Pakistan, all 435 miles of it. In Central Asia, Uzbekistan, despite being landlocked, has closed itself off from its 5 neighbours: Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. The border with Tajikistan is even mined. And on the story goes, through the barriers separating Brunei and Malaysia, Malaysia and Thailand, Pakistan and India, India and Bangladesh, China and North Korea, North and South Korea, and so on around the world. We erect walls for many reasons because we are divided in many ways, in wealth, race, religion, and politics. Sometimes divisions lead to violence, and walls are erected to protect or defend. Sometimes walls go up to keep certain people out. Sometimes physical walls don't go up at all, but we still feel the separation. It's in our minds. These invisible barriers are often just as effective. These walls tell us much about international politics, but the anxieties they represent transcend the nation-state boundaries on which they sit. The primary purpose of the walls appearing throughout Europe is to stop the wave of migrants, but they also say much about wider divisions and instability in the structure of the European Union and within its member nations. President Trump's proposed wall along the US-Mexico border is intended to stem the flow of migrants from the south, but it also taps into a wider fear many of its supporters feel about changing demographics. Division shapes politics at every level, the personal, local, national and international. It's essential to be aware of what has divided us and what continues to do so in order to understand what's going on in the world today. Picture the beginning of Stanley Kubrick's 1968 sci-fi masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the sequence titled The Dawn of Man. On the African savanna in the prehistoric era, a small tribe of proto-man apes are drinking peacefully at a watering hole when another tribe turns up. The individuals are quite happy to share with their own group, but not with this new, other tribe. A shrieking match ensues, in which the new group succeeds in taking over the watering hole, forcing the others to retreat. At this point, if the newcomers had had the nous to make a few bricks and mix some cement, they could have walled off their new possession and guarded it. But given that this is set a few million years ago, they have to fight it out again when the first tribe returns some days later, having boned up on warfare, to reclaim its territory. Grouping into tribes, feeling alarmed by a lot of outsiders, or responding to perceived threats are very human things to do. We form ties that are important for survival, but also for social cohesion. We develop a group identity, and this often leads to conflict with others. Our groups are competing for resources, but with an element of identity conflict also, a narrative of us and them. In the early history of mankind, we were hunter-gatherers. We had not settled or acquired permanent fixed resources that others might covet. Then, in parts of what we now call Turkey and the Middle East, humans started farming. Instead of roaming far and wide to find food or graze livestock, they ploughed the fields and waited for the results. Suddenly, in the context of evolution, more and more of us needed to build barriers. Walls and roofs to house ourselves and our livestock, fences to mark our territory, fortresses to retreat to if the territory was overrun, and guards to protect the new system. The age of walls was upon us, and has long gripped our imagination ever since. We still tell each other tales of the walls of Troy, Jericho, Babylon, Great Zimbabwe, Constantinople, and of the Great Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall, the Inca walls in Peru, and many others. On and on they stretch, through time, region, and culture, to the present. But now they are electrified, topped with searchlights and CCTV. These physical divisions are mirrored by those in the mind, the great ideas that have guided our civilizations and given us identity and a sense of belonging, such as the great schism of Christianity, the split of Islam into Sunni and Shia, and in more recent history, the titanic battles between communism, fascism, and democracy. The title of Thomas Friedman's 2005 book, The World is Flat, was based on the belief that globalization would inevitably bring us closer together. It has done that, but it has also inspired us to build barriers. When faced with perceived threats, the financial crisis, terrorism, violent conflict, refugees and immigration, the increasing gap between rich and poor, people cling more tightly to their groups. The co-founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, believed social media would unite us. In some respects it has, but it has simultaneously given voice and organizational ability to new cyber tribes, some of whom spend their time spewing invective and division across the World Wide Web. There seem now to be as many tribes and as much conflict between them as there have ever been. The question we face today is, what form do our modern tribes take? Do we define ourselves by class, by race, by religion, by nationality? And is it possible for these tribes to coexist in a world where the concept of us and them remains? It all comes down to this us and them concept and the walls we build in our minds. Sometimes the other has a different language or skin colour, a different religion or other set of beliefs. One example of this came up recently when I was in London with a group of 30 leading young journalists from around the world, whom I was helping to train. I'd mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, in which up to 1 million Iranians had died, and had used the possibly clumsy phrase, Muslims killing Muslims. A young Egyptian journalist jumped from his chair and shouted that he could not allow me to say this. I pointed out the statistics from that terrible war, and he replied, "Yes, but the Iranians are not Muslims." The penny dropped, along with my heart. The majority of Iranians are Shia, so I asked him, "Are you saying that the Shia are not Muslims?" "Yes, the Shia are not Muslims." Such divisions do not come down to competition for resources, but rather to a claim that what you think is the only truth, and those with differing views are lesser people. With such certainty of superiority, the walls quickly go up. If you introduce competition for resources, they go up higher. We seem to be in that place now. For the purposes of this book, I use walls as shorthand for barriers, fences, and divisions in all their variety. We do look at physical walls in each chapter, most of which involve bricks and mortar or concrete and wire, but those walls are the what of division, not the why, and they are just the beginning of the story. I haven't been able to cover every divided region. Instead, I have focused on those that best illustrate the challenges of identity in a globalized world: the effects of migration, the USA, Europe, the Indian subcontinent, nationalism as a force for both unity and division, China, the UK, Africa, and the intersections of religion and politics, Israel, the Middle East. In China, we see a strong nation-state with a number of divisions within its borders, such as regional unrest and wealth disparity, that pose a risk to national unity, threatening economic progress and power. Thus, the government must exert control over the Chinese people. The USA is also divided, for different reasons. The era of Trump has exacerbated race relations in the land of the free, but has also revealed a hitherto unrivaled split between Republicans and Democrats, who are more opposed than ever before. It sometimes seems as if it's easier to divide than unite. For example, the myriad complexities of how to put Korea back together were brought into focus by the sketchy agreement between the North and South on denuclearization in the spring of 2018. There were vague murmurings of eventual reunification included in the Panmunjom Declaration for Peace, Prosperity and Unification of the Korean Peninsula. These were in the spirit of the declaration, but the realities of geopolitics soon kicked in. There are 5 players in this game, and each has a different view of the future. The USA's imperative is to prevent North Korea from being able to reach it with a nuclear weapon. However, maintaining a military presence in South Korea is also important to counter China's growing naval power in the Yellow Sea and elsewhere. This latter point does not fit with Chinese strategy, nor with North Korea's ideas about dominating the peninsula, and this, of course, runs counter to South Korea's interests. Meanwhile, the Japanese, who host their own US military bases, would be alarmed at the prospect of a unified Korea, especially one under Chinese influence, as it views the peninsula as a buffer between it and China. These complexities serve as a reminder when we look at the partitions, walls, and divides in this book as to why it is so hard to overcome them at the political level. The divisions between Israel and Palestine are well established, but with so many further subdivisions within each population, it is almost impossible to try to agree upon a solution. Religious and ethnic divisions also spark violence across the Middle East, highlighting the key struggle between Shia and Sunni Muslims. Each incident is the result of complex factors, but much of it comes down to religion, especially the regional rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. On the Indian subcontinent, population movements, now and in the coming years, reveal the plight of those fleeing religious persecution, as well as that of the many economic and climate refugees. In Africa, the borders left behind by colonialism are proving difficult to reconcile with tribal identities that remain strong. Across Europe, the very concept of the EU is under threat as the walls go back up, proving that the differences of the Cold War years haven't entirely been resolved, and that nationalism has never gone away in the age of internationalism. And as the UK leaves the EU, Brexit reveals divisions throughout the kingdom, long-established regional identities, as well as the more recent social and religious tensions that have formed in the era of globalization. In a time of fear and instability, people will continue to group together to protect themselves against perceived threats. Those threats don't just come from the borders, they can also come from within. Chapter 1. China. As in the real world, freedom and order are both necessary in cyberspace. President Xi Jinping. Chinese emperors always struggled to unite their disparate and divided fiefdoms into a unitary whole. President Xi Jinping is no different. He may not be called emperor, but his official titles give the game away. General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, President of the People's Republic of China, Chairman of the Central Commission for Integrated Military and Civilian Development, the list goes on and on. In early 2018, he moved to abolish the rules limiting presidential tenures in office to 2 terms. He's not just a supreme leader, he's a very supreme leader. Everything about what he leads is vast, including the challenges. China's 5 geographical time zones amount to an area the size of the USA. Within this space live 1.4 billion ethnically diverse people, speaking dozens of different languages. It's a multi-ethnic empire with communist Chinese characteristics. There may be 5 geographic time zones, but only one is official. The answer to "what's the time" is whatever time Beijing says it is. This central rule has long been the case, but the 21st century emperor has a luxury few of his precursors enjoyed. He can survey his empire from the air, not just the area encompassed by the Himalayas, to the Sea of Japan and the Gobi Desert, down to the South China Sea, but now the economic empire spanning the globe. Xi is good at quietly projecting his power. He travels more than many of his predecessors. He flies to the world's capitals, confident in the united economic power of the new China, but en route to the airport he will be reminded of how careful Chinese leaders must always be to ensure that the centre holds. As you drive northeast along the airport expressway out of Beijing toward the Great Wall of China, the divisions within the population are at first difficult for an outsider to identify, but then become increasingly easy. Xi can see these at a glance, because many have arisen in his lifetime, some under his leadership. From the city centre, with its gleaming neon-lit temples to consumerism and upscale apartment buildings for the well-off, the road leads on past miles of high-rise flats inhabited by the ever-burgeoning middle class. Farther out are the factory and industrial workers who, year on year, continue to flow in from the countryside to the capital and other big cities. A local can spot which apartment blocks house the better off, and which have been hastily thrown up to cope with the influx. Once one is out into the small towns and villages, there is little neon and less commercialization. In this part of China, the towns are drab, colourless, Spartan affairs with few amenities. To the foreign eye, the overwhelming sense is only of greyness. This is perhaps China's greatest divide, that between the urban and rural, the rich and poor, and, as we will later see, it worries the ruling Communist Party. It knows that the unity and stability of the People's Republic depend to a great extent on bridging the gap, and that its iron grip on the people will slip if it fails to do so. Unity has always been crucial to China's success, and at the same time one of its biggest challenges. In the past, the one thing that played both a physical and symbolic role in unifying the country was the Great Wall of China. If Xi kept going along the expressway, straight past the airport, he'd end up on an 8-lane highway leading farther northeast, and from there arrive at a structure that has gripped the world's imagination. As you approach the Mutianyu section of the Great Wall, the highway diminishes into a simple 2-lane road. The buildings become fewer and the landscape increasingly verdant. A few miles away from the wall, the road leads to a parking lot where you must transfer to a coach to take you to where the road ends. Then it's either a cable car to the top or a steep 2-mile hike, possibly accompanied by a herd of goats. The unguided goat tour is not optional. If the goats want to follow you, they will. If they don't, they won't. Whichever route you choose, you will eventually see something that makes the effort more than worthwhile. When I first gazed over the miles of brickwork snaking along the mountain tops, I was not as overawed as I had been at, say, the Grand Canyon. Nor did I feel overwhelmed, as I was by the world's tallest building, Burj Khalifa, in Dubai. I did not feel political ideology emanating from it, as I did when I visited the Berlin Wall at the height of the Cold War. But there was something else. I felt, rightly or wrongly, that I understood China just a little bit better than before. It didn't make me any sort of expert, far from it, but in that moment I had a much better appreciation of phrases such as ancient culture and the greatest feat in human history, and of the concept that many in the People's Republic still divide the world into those who are Chinese and those who are not. After all, the wall was built around a simplistic idea. On one side of it was civilization, and on the other side barbarity. Behind me, to the south, lay the heartland of the Middle Kingdom, populated by the Han people. To the north, in the far distance beyond the mountains, was where the steppe and desert of Mongolia began, flanked on the right by Manchuria and on the left by the Xinjiang region. Before the wall existed, some 2,500 years ago, the northern mountains offered a degree of protection to the Han, who had developed settled societies in the fertile lands of the North China Plain. But raiding parties, and occasionally whole armies from all three regions, would find ways through the mountain passes, into the flat agricultural lands of the feudal states and cities such as Beijing, Luoyang, and Kaifeng. So, over centuries, the Chinese would develop the quintessential symbol of us and them. The great American sinologist John King Fairbank had perhaps one of the best descriptions of the Great Wall, calling it a line of demarcation separating the steppe from the sown field, nomadism from agriculture, and barbarism from civilization. This fits with the prevailing attitude of sinocentrism at the time, the belief that China was the cultural center on earth and the most advanced civilization. The Han also believed that China's emperor was the only ruler on earth who was mandated by heaven itself, and thus the legitimate emperor of the world. It therefore followed that not only were all other rulers subordinate, but that all other civilizations were inferior. Near neighbors of different ethnicities were to be brought under the rule of the emperor, although they could have their own local leaders. Nearby barbarian states could have kings, but they had to recognize that they were lesser than the Chinese emperor. Even places farther afield, such as Xinjiang, Java, and Japan, were deemed tributary states, and had to pay tribute to the Middle Kingdom. This was not a worldview designed to win friends, but it certainly influenced people, and for long periods it worked. Over the centuries, the Great Wall enhanced China's security, binding it as a political entity and providing the stability to develop farmland in western and northern regions. As the wall stretched westward, it also protected part of the Silk Road, thus furthering economic growth. At its longest, and including the parallel walls, the defensive system stretched for more than 13,000 miles. To give a sense of its magnitude, that is equivalent to 4 walls parallel to each other, each stretching from the east coast of the USA all the way across to the Pacific Ocean, with a lot of bricks to spare. Although the physical role it played in uniting the country diminished over the years, it remained an important symbol in the national consciousness. So much so that after the Communists came to power in 1949, Mao Zedong mentioned the wall in a poem about the Long March titled Mount Liupan, which includes the line, "If we fail to reach the Great Wall, we are not true men." The wording of this line has subsequently been adapted into a popular proverb that says, "One who fails to reach the Great Wall is no hero," meaning, if you can't overcome great difficulties, you're no hero. The poem caused some problems in the new regime, as the Communists seemed to have conflicting views of the wall. Many saw it as a symbol of the nation's feudal past, and believed it should be consigned to history, even encouraging people to vandalize it. But given that Mao had written about it, other communists wanted to visit it to show Chairman Mao's spirit. If you go to the Mu Tianyu section, you can see written in gigantic white characters on the mountaintop, "Loyalty to Chairman Mao." And the wall was mentioned in the national anthem, adopted in 1949, so the party clearly recognized its cultural and historical importance. For the most part, they settled for ignoring it, to begin with at least. During the Cultural Revolution, however, the most fervent of the Red Guards actively destroyed sections of the wall. To them it was part of the Four Olds, which had no place in the new China: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Mao died in 1976, and with him the Cultural Revolution. After 1978, the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, began a methodical reconstruction of the wall. He started slowly. The early post-Mao years were a time for caution, but by 1984 he was confident enough to pronounce, "Let us love our China and restore our Great Wall." In this endeavour, Deng likely had one eye on tourism and foreign currency. The communist leadership was beginning to embrace aspects of capitalism and was well aware of how far China had fallen behind other parts of the world. Laws were passed to make it illegal to damage, remove, or write graffiti on any part of the wall, alongside attempts at rebuilding with mixed success and a drive toward attracting visitors. The Great Wall has played a huge role in the popular imagination of both the Chinese and the rest of the world, although some historians argue that the Europeans were more obsessed by it than the Chinese themselves, and that this contributed toward awareness of and identification with the structure in China itself. So the wall has been instrumental in defining China from outside as well as within its own confines. The wall was only ever partially successful militarily. Without doubt its early warning system, fortifications, and strategic strongholds offered some protection, but these were hardly impregnable. However, its role as a symbol of defense, of dividing the Han from the outsiders, was invaluable. Today it remains an icon of a great and ancient culture. But what of the great and modern culture? Qin Shi Huang, the founder of the Qin dynasty, succeeded in uniting 7 warring states into one China in 221 BCE, but just because it has lasted 23 centuries does not automatically mean it will last another. The Chinese do not like to talk to outsiders about the country's problems or divisions. Whereas you'll not have to go far to find people in Britain or France, say, who will happily tell you their country is going to the dogs, in China it is considered unpatriotic and a loss of face to criticize the state. It might also be risky, given that China remains a one-party dictatorship. Nevertheless, the 23 provinces, 4 municipalities, 5 autonomous regions, and 2 special administrative regions have problems and divisions. One of the biggest is that between the Han heartland and the non-Han areas that surround it in a semicircle. To the northeast is Manchuria, to the north Inner Mongolia, to the northwest Xinjiang, and to the west Tibet. These regions are crucial for security, natural resources, and trade, but they aren't all in favor of Chinese rule. Manchuria is now totally dominated by the Han, but the other regions maintain their own identity, language, customs, and, in the case of Xinjiang and Tibet, their own religions, Islam and Buddhism, and separatist movements. China has tried to control Xinjiang and its Uyghur people for several centuries, but the population has never fully accepted domination by Beijing. There were a series of uprisings in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even a short-lived Eastern Turkestan Republic in the 1930s. Mao annexed Xinjiang in 1949, and it now accounts for about 1/6 of China's territory. To give an idea of how barren and sparsely populated Xinjiang is, it is about half the size of India, but with less than 2% of its population. The intervening years have seen a mass movement of Han settlers into Xinjiang, and in a few years' time they are likely to compose almost half the population, currently at 22 million. This has not gone unopposed. The Uyghurs complain that they are excluded from the better jobs and persecuted by militia formed within state-controlled construction industries, and there are occasional riots and ethnic clashes.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?